it was frankly thrilling to see the basic illiteracy, the basic lack of knowledge that underpins the regime change set in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. federal government and in the U.S. Congress. And it's just so satisfying to see that illustrated.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics, as always, is Robert Morris. How are you this time?
Not bad, Rory. How you doing?
I just want to know, what was on your bingo card for this year? Was it Tucker Carlson calling Ted Cruz an anti-Semite?
That was not on my bingo card, but it was. Yeah, I think you mean Ted Cruz called Tucker Carlson an anti-Semite.
Yes, apologies.
Yes. Though, of course, Ted Cruz would dispute that. It was a fascinating piece of media. I'm not sure if all of you saw it, but Ted Cruz went on Tucker Carlson's YouTube show. Is it a Twitter show? Is it a YouTube show? It's interesting. I think it was intentioned to be initially to be a Twitter show, but it seems like just judging from the complaints that Tucker Carlson has, it does seem like it's now primarily a YouTube show, which is kind of interesting. It's interesting. Tucker Carlson has basically been demoted to being a YouTuber, which is kind of interesting.
But it would appear that it's very profitable to do such a thing, judging by the ads.
The incredible advertisements, the incredible sponsorships that Tucker Carlson has.
So one of the results of this is that a lot of people want to invest in crypto.
It's an interesting sort of media case study because he was booted off Fox News, in part, I believe, for some of the views we're going to be talking about him expressing today. But he almost seems to, it's the classic, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you may strike me down, but you will make me more powerful than I've ever been, is that he makes more news with his YouTube show than he did when he was a Fox News guy. This will, I think, be our second episode that is largely around a Tucker Carlson episode. Didn't we, when he interviewed Putin, didn't we do a whole, I think we did a whole episode on that.
And also with Jon Stewart as well.
He interviewed Jon Stewart? No, you're talking about 20 years ago?
Yeah, when he was humiliated.
For sure, but that's when he was still working for cable news. Like Tucker Carlson has, in fact, become a independent media brand, which is ridiculous. So the actual Ted Cruz interview with Tucker Carlson, we will get into, but I thought it was worth getting into because it is emblematic of a larger trend that anybody following my Twitter presence will see that it's a rabbit hole I've fallen rather far down in recent weeks. I used to bill myself as a conservative. I no longer do so. I see myself as kind of a New Deal Democrat at this point, sort of not sympathetic to many individual Democratic Party figures, but am actively antagonistic to pretty much everything Donald Trump, Republicans, or the Make America Great Again movement has to offer, which has made like the past month or so very, very confusing for me. I am becoming a New Deal Democrat, very interested in what the Democratic Party does, how things change in the Democratic Party. I vote in Democratic primaries in the city that I live in, New York City, what have you. But I'm also remain, as I always have been, desperate for any voice in American life that is anti-war. Any voice at all that is against intervention, that is, this is why I called myself a libertarian for a decade, largely because of Ron Paul and figures like him. So I'm desperate. One of the things that really sold Bernie Sanders to me was his willingness to be anti-war. And one of the greatest barrier to me just full on donating, joining the DNC or whatever is just how bloodthirsty most of the Democratic Party is. And of course, in this political development that I've had, I've always associated the Republican Party with, bombing Iraq, trying to bomb Iran, as Donald Trump just has, just being as violent and nasty as possible. So imagine my shock and confusion over this past month of the rush to war with Iran to see that some of what I had traditionally seen as some of the vilest and some of the most irritating figures on the Republican Party and the Donald Trump right were the highest, and this is really key here, even as marginalized as these figures now are, none of them are as officially powerful as they used to be. Steve Bannon was helping to run the White House initially and put Donald Trump in power. Now he's basically a podcaster. Tucker Carlson has fallen from Fox News to shilling gold guns and nicotine on his YouTube channel. But these folks, even as fallen as they are, have been the highest profile people in American life arguing against war with Iran. That is an incredible condemnation of the Democratic Party, for sure, and for Democratic media figures, for sure. But it is where we are. The one that just is the most galling to me is, are you familiar with Marjorie Taylor Greene, or MTG for short?
Yeah, she does come across quite abrasive anytime she talks. She is very all attack, but definitely anti-war is something I'm surprised that she's for.
Yeah, she's a lunatic, and I have enough exposure to her scandals around here over. I think she's been in Congress. She's at least on her second term at this point, maybe further. So 2-3 years or so, and yeah, she's bonkers. She believes in weird conspiracy theories.
Jewish space lasers, I think, the famous one.
I think Jewish space lasers. I can't recall the details, but I do think MTG is the source of Jewish space lasers. But when it comes to Iran, sadly, she's one of the sanest people in Congress.
Yeah.
And that is an incredible condemnation of the rest of Congress. Of course, so she writes these infinite screeds on Twitter, on Elon Musk's Twitter. She had one in particular that was just like, wow. She was like, it was basically like the military-industrial complex drags us into all kind of stuff. Like there's this through line from Vietnam to Iraq to Syria to what's happening right now and to Russia, and we shouldn't do this. What we should be doing is fighting the cartels in Mexico. It was like, oh, man.
So close.
You almost got it. And interestingly, I think there's been some subsequently where she's like, no, actually, let's just not do all these wars. So that is very confusing. But it is a real dynamic. Charlie Kirk. Do you know who Charlie Kirk is?
The name's familiar.
He's got a face you want to punch. Like if you just Google him and you'll see. His whole shtick was, I think, having not completed university.
Okay.
He became a leader in this group called Turning Point USA.
Yes, I know him now. I think famously he was at Oxford trying to debate, and he got kind of destroyed.
Oh, God, I can't imagine how bad that would have been. But yeah, his sort of thing was like, oh, I'm like a guy in his mid-20s who's going to go. I guess he's aging out of, but I think he's still probably in his latter 20s or early 30s. But he was initially, I'm the young guy who's going to go and debate these leftists on the campuses. And I think that sort of was
I think the big thing is the two main tricks is, they're young people. They're not expecting to be debated that day. And quite often he just changes the subject once he's losing.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's teenagers he's used to debating against. So I do not doubt that he would have lost miserably at the Oxford Union. So this is a guy like, it's like, well, Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon, these are people who have done things with their lives and like, at least, have some weight.
Okay, yeah, still quite young, 31.
Yeah, 31. Yeah, Charlie Kirk is not somebody that I have any previous respect for. However, his tweets over the past month have been like, he's a prominent figure who has been prominently and vocally anti-war. And it's very perplexing to me, but that is what's happening. Does
he have any military background or anything?
I don't know. I don't know anything about that.
Editing Rory here. He does not have any military background.
Yeah, so Charlie Kirk, Steve Bannon, Steve Bannon was such a vilified figure that in the early Trump administration, Saturday Night Live, the sketch comedy show in the United States that is actually got probably, despite being less culturally significant than it has been at any point in the United States, probably has more international reach than it ever has because, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, they started putting up their sketches or the more popular sketches on YouTube. So it reaches sort of everywhere. In the initial years of the first Trump administration, Saturday Night Live would just produce, like, their Steve Bannon character was the personification of death. Like they'd have like people being Donald Trump or like Jeff Sessions, there'd be somebody playing Jeff Sessions in like very similar caricature ways, and then like Steve Bannon would just be like from like from a Christmas Carol, like a Charles Dickens, like be the ghost of Christmas future, just like Satan or whatever, like death personified. So Steve Bannon, who I think fell out with Trump, lost power, might have gone to jail, I can't recall, now has a podcast, and yeah, he is being super anti-war, and it's a very interesting dynamic.
Do you think it's a libertarian thing through them, or where do you think it comes from?
So Tucker Carlson specifically, who is sort of certainly the most prominent member of this anti-war set, has actually talked a lot about how he's giving up on libertarianism.
Okay.
How he's distancing himself from libertarianism.
Because he talks about in this interview multiple times that he was a big supporter of the Iraq War. He championed it, and he now it feels, ashamed of that, and is now sort of gone completely the other way when it comes to American intervening around the world in a violent manner.
Feel very stung by what happened in Iraq, if I'm being honest. Possibly because, unlike you, I guess, I supported it, and I saw us get drawn into it in a way that nobody anticipated.
Yeah, so if we get into this conversation a little bit, that's a really interesting tension in what Tucker Carlson is saying. Ted Cruz wants to talk about Ronald Reagan. Ted Cruz wants to talk about free enterprise. And Tucker Carlson kind of nods along with all of that, but doesn't really like sort of go on that in like whole hog. What Tucker Carlson wants to talk about, which is, I think, on some levels horrifying to me as somebody who lived in Washington, D.C. for 8 years. He really wants to talk about how the U.S. Congress should take over Washington, D.C. again and clean out all the homeless people and, turn the police more brutal or whatever.
Yeah, that was something that I kind of miss, because usually when, internationally, when you hear the term Washington, you think sort of, oh, this is the capital of America, so it's almost like the personification of American power. But is he meaning literally?
Yes, he means literally.
That was one of the things that threw me, is so he's literally talking about Washington, D.C. To him is a bit grubby and could do with being cleaned up.
That's a long-standing issue, and also as someone who lived in Washington, D.C. for 8 years, from 2003 to 2011, he's on crack. Like that is an insane way to talk about Washington, D.C., frankly, especially considering, as I know he well knows, where Washington, D.C. was in the 1990s and where it is today. Like, Washington, D.C. is an infinitely friendlier, more peaceful, more prosperous, more pleasant place to be than it was in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s. Sorry. So yeah, Washington, D.C., a place where I lived, is, I use it as a stand-in for the evils of the military-industrial complex. Oh, Washington, D.C. But Washington, D.C. is also a really vibrant city of 800,000 people within this little square, which is I guess it's more of a diamond, which is the District of Columbia. If you look at the Washington, D.C. metro area, you've probably got 5 or 6 million people, which makes it within the top 10 metro areas in the country. But most of those people there's 800,000 people in Washington, D.C. proper. And then there's, I think, 1 million people is it Fairfax County or there's like 1 million people each in the 2 counties in Maryland and the 2 counties in Virginia that surround Washington, D.C. But Washington, D.C. itself, and this is interesting because at least until recently, Maryland and Virginia were more conservative states and, would sort of have what's kind of interesting is the way that Washington, D.C. has, certainly in Virginia's case, turned Virginia a lot more liberal.
Okay.
The suburbs of Washington, D.C. have become much more powerful in Virginia more broadly, which is a fascinating dynamic. But in between the suburbs where a lot of the people who work in Washington, D.C. actually live, there is Washington, D.C. itself. And I lived in Washington, D.C. itself for 8 years. And this was actually a big bugbear for Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a Democratic senator. Basically, in the 80s and 90s, during white flight, during the crack epidemic, during the suburbanification of the country, a lot of inner cities emptied out. Washington, D.C. went from being 800,000 people in like the 50s to when I moved there, it was, I think, down to like barely 600,000 people. And yeah, like it was kind of bleak. When I moved into my apartment in Mount Pleasant in 2003, 3 kids had gotten shot on my
Oh
street
God.
that 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 summer.
Hmm.
It was a little bleak. The Now it's a fascinating dynamic that Washington D.C. itself, because of its history, essentially most of the white people had left by the end of the 20th century. It was famously, this is an actual term that's used. It sounds a little racist, but it's a chocolate city. It was an African
Okay.
American majority city. And by the time of Lyndon Baines Johnson and the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, that meant it was a fervently democratic city. The white people that were sadly, this is not a complete circle of a Venn diagram, but there are a lot more overlap than reflects well on the United States. The white people in Washington, D.C. tended to also be very, very educated and wealthier than the African American majority. But all of those folks were Democrats as well,
Hmm.
more often than not, because that's the thing about the way that Washington, D.C. works. And this is a generalization that is not entirely true, but I think there's a lot of truth to it, that if you're a Republican who comes to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
to work for a Republican administration, you're a lot more likely to live in the Maryland or Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because you can. I mean,
So you don't live in Washington, D.C.
so
proper?
Washington, D.C. proper is tiny. Like, I lived in sort of the top corner of the diamond, and I went down.
It's almost like the city of London, and then the rest is technically Westminster.
It's a lot bigger than the city of London, but yes, that's a great analogy. So I lived at sort of the northwest of the diamond, not all the way up, but a significant way up. And I went to a law school, George Washington, that was sort of not at the bottom of the diamond, but almost all the way down to the National Mall or whatever. And it would take me 17 minutes to get there, from Mount Pleasant to Foggy Bottom on a bicycle. In Washington, D.C., a bicycle is by far the best way to get around. You can
And it also has a underground as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it has a metro system.
That is apparently covered in advertising for Raytheon and stuff.
Oh yeah. And that metro system goes out into the Maryland and the Virginia suburbs. So to the point I was making was not only was it a predominantly African American city when I moved there, I'm not sure if it still is, it may not be, but also the people, the wealthy professional people who lived in the city instead of in the suburbs tended to also be Democrats. So it's it's a tremendously blue city, laughably blue city. New York, California, maybe 60% sometimes Democratic, 40% Republican, or something maybe it's in the the high 30s for Republican representation. Washington, D.C. is 99%.
Wow.
Or 80% Democratic.
So does that mean just the Republicans kind of hate living there?
So the Republicans just hate Washington, D.C. But what's interesting about Tucker Carlson, Washington, D.C. has always had so you mentioned the metro. I really didn't mean to make this an episode about Washington, D.C., but I lived there for 8 years and I loved it. So we're talking about it. Washington, D.C. basically is the only American city, I think, that constructed a usable metro in the later 20th century.
Okay.
And that was through massive government funding. So it did not have a metro system in 1970. And by the time I moved there in 2003, it had a metro system that covered most of the city. Famously, the richest, the wealthiest, the whitest, the mansionist part of Washington, D.C. is Georgetown, which you might have heard of. And it has no access to the metro system. Because they did not want the poors. They did not want the poors and the blacks to be able to get there easily.
That's fascinating, because I know that the saying is basically, the transport's good when middle class and upper class people use it. And it almost seems because it does look quite modern compared to a lot of other undergrounds in America. I know the subway in New York's hanging together from what I hear.
Well, it is. I mean, it is more modern. I mean, it was built starting in the 1970s. So it is. It's also kind of it's the only piece of brutalist architecture I like. It's got a very. I have a lot of affection for Washington, D.C.
I think brutalist is very hit or miss. There's one or two that are nice, and the rest are just horrendous.
But anyway, Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. has had battles with the Congress, and it was actually a Democratic senator who led the charge in the 80s to try to clean up Washington, D.C. Because even when I was getting there in 2003, like this was I think Daniel Patrick Moynihan might have still been in the Senate when I got there in 2003. Yeah, I think he was replaced by Hillary Clinton, actually. Anyway, there had been a longstanding effort to clean up the area around the Capitol, but like the Washington Monument, our nation's phallus, that big, what George Washington's erection and the reflecting pool and the Capitol building, the area surrounding that famously was pretty bleak.
Okay.
There was the Capitol Hill neighborhood, which was sort of down to the I think kind of the south and east had been sort of kind of gentrified and built up and nice since like, or maybe it was just always just, it never completely fell into urban blight because staffers wanted to, some staffers always wanted to live around there. But to the north of it, it was really just grim and bleak and destroyed. And by the time I moved there in 2003, there were developments around Chinatown, developments north of it, of the capital area that actually made it a lot nicer. But there are still 800,000 people that work there. There's still great tensions. Muriel Bowser, I don't know if she's still the mayor of Washington, D.C., but during 2020 and this sort of Black Lives Matter thing where Trump going into Trump marching with Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, into riots in Washington, D.C., that's a clash between the federal government and the very, very democratic government of Washington, D.C., the city itself. So first off, I guess we're finally getting to Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz. It's very interesting because I think the broader point that Tucker Carlson is making is one that I agree with, which is that we have wasted an extraordinary amount of money on this foreign policy nonsense when we should be spending it at home to fix the problems at home.
I am the product of the last 25 years watching carefully, being involved in the periphery, and I see an unending string of foreign policy disasters that have impoverished and hurt our country.
Unending string.
Unending string. They would include Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria.
I couldn't agree with Tucker Carlson more on that. $6 trillion. This isn't something they mentioned, but we're currently, I think the national debt is somewhere at like $36 trillion right now. $6 trillion of that is just Iraq and Afghanistan, 2 wars we lost.
Because I think bombing cost, recent bombing on the Iranian nuclear power mountain was between $1 and $2 billion.
Really? That's extraordinary. Unsurprising, but certainly the whole war itself cost billions and billions. I mean, the interceptors cost that Israel went through in 12 days cost at least $1 billion. Getting the aircraft carriers there, that's another $1 billion. I mean,
so I think support for Israel since October 7th is around 24 billion.
24 billion, which is a really great point. That's another exchange between Tucker and
that's something. Well, this is something I want to point out is, if you've heard about this interview, you'll always hear the bit about, how many people live in Iran. But it feels about 80% of this interview is how much of Israel is influencing you. Where does Israel and America end? Why are we doing what Israel tell us? They are a foreign nation at the end of the day. Like, it's very borderline not anti-Israel, but kind of like, why are we doing everything they tell us indefinitely?
Is it in America's interest for Israel to spy on us, including on the president?
I think that's a great point, and that's I mean, I don't know if I go as far as to recommend this, but I was surprised and impressed by this conversation, how much more meaty it was. Because I was like, okay, so like...
oh, yeah, absolutely. I was like, this is going to be the only bit that I knew of beforehand, I was like, the rest of it's going to be a fluff piece. But like, this is like a proper debate. They're really at each
antagonistic. Yeah, it's a very antagonistic debate, which like gets at a lot of what the conflict is within the sort of MAGA movement and Republicans and this, that, and the other thing in really fascinating ways. But just to finish that Washington, D.C. thought, what Tucker Carlson says we should spend more money at home, and I couldn't agree with him more on that. But because he's Tucker Carlson, because he's still, and that's a fascinating thing here, is like, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Steve Bannon, like Charlie Kirk, like Tucker Carlson still believe a lot of insane things.
Oh, yeah.
And like It's fascinating because it's watching Tucker Carlson. You asked earlier if he was a libertarian. I've seen him talking about how he very much is not a libertarian anymore. How he has, he was a libertarian once, but he learned how disastrous that was. And I think that's kind of fascinating, his evolution. But he still he can't come straight out. And that's another great tension between Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson is Ted Cruz is talking about, look at this painting of Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, Tucker, I agree with you that democratic cities are poorly run and that liberals.
Well, something they keep mentioning is we agree on about 80% of things. We're only talking about the 20% we don't.
The 20% where we disagree, I do think is meaningful. And it's mostly in the foreign policy space.
And that's a really interesting thing because Ted Cruz is working very, very hard to portray them as agreeing on stuff. Tucker Carlson isn't working quite as hard, but the fact that they both end up talking about Washington, D.C. so much is like an effort on both of their parts to say that they agree.
Because would Tucker Carlson be more popular than Ted Cruz?
Infinitely. Like Ted Cruz is a slimy little.
Because it's hard to judge because I just sort of, I'm like, oh, he's a guy I don't like. So I don't know exactly how popular is he in Texas. Is he actually good for Texas? What's his dynamics? Or is he basically doing his best to suck up to Tucker in this interview?
He's a Texas senator who sucks up to all the right people, as witnessed by when I became senator, I decided I was going to be the #1 supporter of Israel.
That's what's best for Texas.
Yeah, that's what's best for Texas, clearly. No, Ted Cruz is awful. And I mean, I think the fact that Ted Cruz was willing to submit to what is probably the most antagonistic interview he's ever gotten. I mean, I think that's probably the most antagonistic interview that he's ever sat down for.
There's no representative of the Israeli government there. You have when you're in Dallas, you're meeting with...
This is such a false and silly conversation. I know all this. The question is are AIPAC's goals shaped by the goals of the Israeli government to any extent?
Okay, that's
a really
different
simple
from
question.
lobbying on behalf of.
It's a simple question. Are AIPAC's goals shaped by the goals of the Israeli government? And I'm just going to ask you that question straightforwardly. And if you say no, I think we both know that's not true.
Okay.
Probably the most antagonistic interview that he's ever sat down for is an indicator of just how popular Tucker Carlson is. But just one last time to that Washington, D.C. point is I think Tucker Carlson will always be like, of course, I worship Ronald Reagan, and of course, free enterprise is amazing. And he's doing ads in his YouTube thing for Hillsdale College, which is still that corporation funded, like, yeah, we need more libertarian free enterprise and we need to give more power to monopolies. Whereas, capitalism, pro-business fundamentalism is magic. Whereas it's pretty obvious to me that Tucker Carlson is falling away from that. But the way that he can't say, Jesus Christ, we need to use this $6 trillion like at home to do some redistribution for the love of God. He's like, why aren't we using this money to give more money to the DC police and tell them to go brutalize poor people?
Yeah,
because that's like his audience. And it's fascinating watching Tucker Carlson try to bring along his audience and the fundamental ridiculousness of talking. And Tucker Carlson absolutely knows this because Tucker Carlson was absolutely getting drunk in Washington, D.C. bars, 5 to 10 years before I was, and knows that Washington, D.C. is, because of the war on terror, actually, is a effing paradise for rich white people. Like when I moved to Washington, D.C. in 2003, white people who sort of worked in the nonprofits or the government or whatnot lived in and around that one neighborhood off of the Capitol. They lived in and around Georgetown. And because of some pioneering gay guys in the 90s, they lived in sort of DuPont Circle, Adams Morgan. And I lived on the very edge of that. And then there was some like more quasi-suburban stuff up Connecticut Avenue and like the far northwest of the city. And that was it. Today, like the whole city is being gentrified. Like when I go back to Washington, D.C., I had some friends for years. They would like get a kick out of taking me like not to a new venue, like a new restaurant or a new place to see a concert, to taking me to a whole new neighborhood, like for gentrifiers that I had never heard of or talked about before. Like I meet young people from Washington, D.C., and they just talk about it is there was as there was everywhere else in the world, after 2020, there was a minor spike in crime that people like Tucker Carlson have blown wildly out of proportion. But in like the late 1990s and into the 2000s, and DC was weird because it was kind of like, it was like behind the major crime wave everywhere else in the country. I don't know why that was, but it was sort of still in the throes of that in the early 2000s. And like to claim that somehow like Washington, D.C. is out of control under crime right now in this yuppie paradise that has been, imposed on what was I think it was a better and more interesting and cooler city because I was in my 20s back then. I am no longer in my 20s, but like on every metric. When I moved there, it was like 670,000 people. Now it's back over 800,000 and is bigger than it was before. So like Washington, D.C. is like at the end of like 3 decades of incredible success. And for Tucker Carlson to be like, oh, now it's time for the Congress to really like crush home rule. And it's nonsense.
You've been in the district a long time in D.C., so have I. And the city's way more dangerous, and Congress runs this city.
No, it's a complete crap hole.
So I'm saying, like, no Iranian's ever going to kill me, but I could get carjacked here. And I just don't understand how the Congress could run this city and focus on the dangers of Iran when the city is like garbage. It's garbage.
But I think it's a really interesting explication of the tension between Ted Cruz, who's very much, and it's weird. Congress people, because they go to old rich people, are way behind the times, by definition. Like, and you could really see that in this conversation because Ted Cruz just wants to talk about Ronald Reagan won us the Cold War, and it's like man.
He's putting out the old line, which is that America had so much money and was putting so much money into military that Russia had to meet it, and then it bankrupted itself, which I don't think is what caused the Soviet Union to collapse.
It's absolutely incredible. Like it is such a transparent. The military-industrial complex is magic, guys. Like, we did nothing useful. We never actually figured out how to make Star Wars work, but magically, what made the Soviet Union fall was the oil crisis, giving them way too much money, and then Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve, efficiency policies throughout the federal government and the world, creating an incredible. So basically, the 1970s make the Soviet Union tremendously dependent on oil and gas sales, and then the price of that goes into the gutter through the 1980s.
But also it was rotten to its core as well. There's so much wrong with the Soviet Union.
So much wrong with the Soviet Union. But the main thing Ronald Reagan did to defeat the Soviet Union was reappoint Paul Volcker to be the chair of the Federal Reserve.
But he said tear down the wall, and then it fell down.
It was shining truth and light that tore it down. It was also rebuilding the American military.
Yeah, exactly. I just
think it's funny after like listening to the debate Ronald Reagan had with Bush that I listened to recently, thanks to yourself. I'm like, he seems like such a completely different guy than everyone talks about him as.
Well, yeah, it was 40 years ago, 45 years. It's
but
like,
that's something you'd expect. What they were saying in that debate is something I'd expect out of Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. Well, just talking about immigration.
And then, because when I was reading the comments, it was basically saying like how, the politicians were terrible and they were bought and sold and they were forced to say this. It's so funny that, it seems the Republicans despised that they were even considering such notions.
Yeah. I mean, it was in a lot of ways, it was a more serious era.
Because Reagan's point is basically, I want them to be citizens so they can pay tax.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It was a more serious era on every level, I think, in part because, those were men who thought they were fighting a real competition against a rival country. There hasn't been any kind of real competition. And Tucker kind of expresses this. He's like, yeah, like we won the Cold War. We were super excited about this. Why are we still so, why are we so unhappy? Like, how have we squandered this victory so much? And the obvious answer as to why that we've squandered this victory is that we have wasted all this money abroad. Transparently, obviously.
And not doing good things with it.
And not doing good things with it. Exactly. We've made the world worse and more dangerous at extraordinary expense. And Tucker Carlson realizes this. What I was surprised by, actually, was that Ted Cruz was trying to make the case that he was a restrainer, that he was against intervening in places. Normally, I think Tucker Carlson punctured pretty well.
But it is interesting that it starts off basically, how much is Israel influencing you, and are we just doing everything Israel tells us? And then it seems to it switches completely because, I think both of us are on Tucker's side when he's like critiquing how much influence Israel has, and then instantly switches where they're basically saying, "Oh, Russia's the worst thing in the world," and then Tucker's like, "No, I actually think Russia's brilliant, and this war should be over, and you should stop." I think in both scenarios, this is before America had bombed Iran. They're both portraying it as if they're fighting the war, like they're Ukraine and Israel, which I thought was interesting.
Well, what's interesting is the way that Tucker tries to make that distinction with Ted Cruz, and Ted Cruz is incapable of making that distinction. Like, Ted Cruz keeps getting caught up in the, what are you talking about? Israel's doing this, not we're doing this, but like you just said, we're doing this. Like, and it's...
Well, he kind of proves his point where he is unable to see the difference between America and Israel.
It is fascinating. It is interesting to watch like Tucker's like tics and like sort of irritating laughing.
To get to the Senate was to defend Israel. I'm like, I don't think I'm the one who's obsessed with Israel.
Okay,
I don't even think about Israel.
Tucker, words matter.
He seems an interesting man to be interviewed by, because he kind of giggles and acts sort of strange, which is hard to like go full force and attack him.
But it's effective, and it was interesting watching this and seeing that stuff that usually just I find so
grating,
that so grating and irritating, and just watching it being used for good, because as loathsome as many of Tucker Carlson's views are, I really think, I mean, like, what he's been doing over the past couple weeks has been frankly kind of heroic. Like, I think if you want to construct like a selfish reason for why Tucker Carlson is doing this, I think you can say that he has, I think, accurately judged that history will be kind to him, that this is in fact where the Republican Party is moving. This is where the U.S. public is moving. I think that he's accurately judged that. And if you want to make it seem selfish on his part, he wants to get ahead of the wave, and he wants to be seen leading the wave. But regardless, I think it is fairly brave.
Are we seeing the coming civil war when Trump is not around within the Republican Party?
It's a great question. And it's fascinating that Donald Trump Jr. is another one of these figures who has spent, the past couple months, like, retweeting like libertarian anti-war comedians and this, that, and the other thing is, how much of a civil war can there be, Vuri, when there's no actual organic support for the warmongering? Yeah, no, for war.
Okay.
Like, who actually likes this stuff?
Editing Rory here. Just to give a bit of context, YouGov asked people, do you want the US to be at war with Iran? And the US public answered 95% no.
Like, I think Tucker is being very brave. Tucker Carlson is being very brave in this issue space, but I think he's also a good judge of the way that the worm is turning. Like,
well, because he's proven himself, like, because he did leave Fox and he's still massively successful. And it's hard to know, is he making more or less now? But he's definitely paying the mortgage, that's for sure.
He's paying the mortgage. I would assume he's making less, but because I think as soon as he does get to a point where he's making more, to be clear, this Ted Cruz interview, I assume, is the one of the most successful.
Oh yeah, it's got millions, and that's on his own YouTube. So what's he getting in other places?
Yeah, I mean it's probably one of the most successful things that he's done, and it's interesting. He makes news with his interviews. He makes much more news with his interviews on YouTube than he did when he was a Fox News host, which I think gives an indicator that a lot of that cable news is not actually designed to break news, to actually, tell us new things.
Well, his most popular is the Putin interview, which is unsurprising, I guess.
Yeah. But it's not like it's actually designed to, the cable news is not designed to actually inform us or challenge us.
Yeah, make the news.
It is designed to provide window dressing and propaganda. I think Tucker Carlson back in 2020 personally played a role in diffusing the Qasem Soleimani situation. And I think that predated his getting fired by Fox News, actually. I think that might have, in fact, led to his being fired by Fox News.
Okay, interesting.
Which I think is an interesting dynamic. But yeah, so back to the conversation, Ted Cruz is appealing to elderly donors and is appealing to elderly rich donors.
Who love Israel.
Yeah, I mean, those that love Israel, those that don't. It's interesting that the richest donor of them all, Charles Koch, of the Koch brothers. I'm not sure if Charles is the one that's still alive or not.
Okay.
But the Koch brothers are sort of the mirror image of George Soros, the much demonized Democratic funder. These are the guys behind the Tea Party. And they actually are pretty anti-war. The surviving Koch brother is actually pretty anti-war and has helped to fund the Quincy Institute. In one of the more interesting team-ups in American political history, George Soros and Charles Koch have teamed together to fund an anti-war think tank, the Quincy Institute. Which is fascinating.
That's brilliant.
Which actually does a lot of really good work and employs a lot of intellectuals who I find...
Were the Kochs always anti-war, or is this a new...
Well, they were big supporters of George W. Bush, so they couldn't have been that anti-war.
Yeah.
I think perhaps the Koch brother, this is complete, I haven't seen anything to indicate this. This is complete speculation.
So yeah, David's the one that died.
Says Charles is the one that's left? Yeah. I think it's entirely possible that the Koch brothers saw how their agenda was completely derailed. The Koch brothers probably would have deferred to Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. They were probably guys who could be impressed by Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, these guys who've been at the heart of Republican politics and U.S. government going back to the 1970s or 1960s in Rumsfeld's case. And I would imagine that they felt pretty ripped off by the Iraq War. And this is a key argument that a lot of conservatives have been making, is that if you want to be like George W. Bush and have no legacy other than war, letting Netanyahu draw you into war in Iran is the way to go. So I would imagine the Kochs, who wanted to privatize Social Security and do all kinds of other crazy libertarian stuff, got completely derailed by this Iraq war that the Bush administration sold them. I could see them wanting to be, and honestly, I think any honest libertarian knows that the classic quote, war is the health of the state. The reason why Washington, D.C. is such a yuppie's paradise now is because of war funding, whether it was, is because of the war on terror.
Is this something we maybe should have mentioned in the other episode? But the Kochs, I think, made a lot of their money through oil, and this war seemed to have made the oil price go down.
Which one?
The recent Iran-Israel war.
Well, absolutely. You had a tremendous collapse in the oil and gas price when Trump unleashed his series of peace tweets. His rather deranged but comforting series of peace tweets. But yeah, so the Koch brothers, I think, probably got to a point where they definitely got to a point where they were angrier at the warmongers than they were eager to support them. It makes sense because if you look honestly at what has been happening, you have to come to the conclusion that our foreign policy is an incredibly wasteful, pointless, and counterproductive project. And it's interesting because Ted Cruz is enough of a politician that he wants to portray himself
a peacemaker,
being open to that idea, but Carlson rather quickly points out that he can't distinguish between his country's interests and Israel's interests.
When you first ran for Congress, you elucidated one of your main goals, which is to defend Israel.
Yes.
And there's a poll exchange in here that goes entirely unchallenged by Tucker Carlson. I guess in part because he's like, well, I don't want to be here for 3 hours. Ted Cruz says, I supported sanctions on Nord Stream. And if those sanctions had gone through, the war would never have happened. And I'm like, buddy.
So I drafted sanctions legislation that was targeted to stop the pipeline.
he made it out like, the TV series 24. It's as if there was like a ticking clock, and as soon as Biden got in, he gave it the okay, and then Russia rolled their tanks in, and then it's like the second he was out, Trump shut it down. It's like I don't think Nord Stream had that much to do with it. But sorry, just one thing that I was fascinated by it is like we still don't really have a conclusive evidence of who did Nord Stream.
We don't.
I just think it's fascinating. It's not basically like, oh, we all think it's this. Like, it feels like everyone can just say whoever they want.
Well, I think we didn't we do a whole story on Seymour
We
Hersh?
did a whole episode and we disagreed, but also they also disagree, which is fascinating.
Well, so we did a whole episode, I think, and our conclusion, at least my conclusion, was like, Seymour Hersh, he's an amazing reporter, but he's a little old, and I think this just seems too elaborate and fantastical. Did you see that Seymour Hersh called Donald Trump's attack on Iran?
No.
Yeah, so Seymour Hersh is the guy who has provided the most detailed, most inflammatory. Really, I mean, Seymour Hersh's take on Nord Stream, we did a whole episode on it, is basically like that the attack on Nord Stream was entirely cooked up by the U.S. government. Here are the locations where it was planned. Here are the institutions that planned it, this, that, and the other thing. And here are the Ukrainian cutouts that we used to actually carry it out or whatever. And my contention when that came out, and I'm now thinking I might have been wrong about this, was, okay, Seymour Hersh, he's in his 80s. He's over the hill. But last, I guess, a week or so back, he said this weekend, Donald Trump is going to attack the nuclear sites, and here's how it's going to happen. And Seymour Hersh was absolutely right. So Seymour Hersh clearly still has incredible sources within the U.S. government.
Okay.
The fact that Seymour Hersh got this so correct makes me wonder if Seymour Hersh's story of Nord Stream is more credible.
I think you believe America did that. Is that right?
Of course.
Okay, I think the chances of that are zero.
You think Russia did it?
No, I think Ukraine did it.
Well, I think I'm kind of with Tucker on this, which is like, okay, sure, maybe it was the Norwegians, maybe it was NATO or Ukraine, but it was obviously us, more broadly speaking. And I don't think anybody disputes that any longer.
Okay.
Like,
well, I'm on Team Russia.
huh?
I think
You're
the
still on
Russians
team?
did it.
Seriously? Still?
Yeah.
Really? How?
Well, no, I think they wanted it so people couldn't replace Putin afterwards. That they could just get all this free gas. So it's like, we're in this to the end, and you can't replace me.
I don't really buy it, but yeah, we don't need to have a debate on Nord Stream. But anyway, Seymour Hersh, I want to go back and read Seymour Hersh's coverage because he got this conflict.
Okay, brilliant.
He got this conflict right. Yeah, but just that idea that like Ted Cruz was going to stop the war between Russia and Ukraine by sanctioning Nord Stream, it strikes me as a truly delusional read on what was going on in the early months of 2022.
So I can say what I did personally, sanctioning Nord Stream 2 worked and prevented a war. And if Trump had still been there, if the sanction had been in effect, there would be no war.
But, that's Ted Cruz. There's a lot of delusional stuff going on here. The idea that the United States is both incredibly powerful and can bring about positive results through military force, which has been disproven over and over and over and over again. Yet at the same time, the United States has no responsibility for anything that happens. It was fascinating watching Tucker Carlson bring up 2014 and the U.S. involvement in overthrowing the democratically elected president of Ukraine. And he just sort of goes, no, let's talk about Nord Stream. Like, he just clearly has never been challenged on any of these positions. I mean, so the two clips that everybody saw was Ted Cruz not knowing how many people live in Iran, which sort of came at the end of the conversation when it had sort of really, by the end, it becomes like a full-on antagonistic interview.
Oh yeah, they're shouting over each other at points. It's hard to make out who's talking or like what they're saying.
It's delightful to watch. Like, what's that classic meme from like Godzilla versus King Kong? And sort of, let them fight! You know, it's delightful to watch. The other one that got a lot of play was the fact that Ted Cruz doesn't know anything about the Bible, where he doesn't know the passage.
Yes. Tucker loves showing off his knowledge.
Yeah, he doesn't know the passage that refers to defending Israel, and he also is like, you moron! Like, the Bible is not talking
About modern day Israel.
about a nation state founded in 1947. I saw this on Twitter, so I can't really verify it, but someone was saying that, in fact, like the folks who were founding Israel, like only decided to call it Israel like a month or two before like independence. Like it wasn't really, and it's just like it was frankly thrilling to see the basic illiteracy, the basic lack of knowledge that underpins the regime change set in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. federal government and in the U.S. Congress. And it's just so satisfying to see that illustrated. There was an interesting part at the end where Ted Cruz was getting angry at what Joe Biden had done to lift sanctions against, not actually explicitly lift sanctions against Iran, allowing Iran to sell oil to China, essentially just sort of let it happen. And now Donald Trump has gone further than Joe Biden in actually lifting the sanctions. So Iran can now openly sell oil to China, which is kind of fascinating. And it's just great illustrations of how Donald Trump supporters quickly get
the new memo.
Well, no. So basically how Donald Trump supporters, his inconsistency makes it impossible to be a thorough Donald Trump supporter, because you'll condemn a policy and then the next day he'll be all for it.
But is that not also part of his charm, that he's somewhat vague, so many people can float around him with contradictory ideas?
Sure. I mean, that's certainly part of it. But I would say that, like, this is honestly, like, I think it's a fascinating document of certainly of the disarray within the Republican camp, but also of just the purely bizarre nature of the contortions that U.S. Congress people have had to force themselves into to justify, especially at the end of the 25 years we've just had, how ridiculous it looks, and how the Congress people have to insulate themselves entirely from any interview where the interviewer knows anything. It just basic reality has to be entirely ignored, lied about, skittered away from as soon as possible, quickly as possible. And, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I am grateful to Tucker Carlson for providing this. It's fascinating.
But I would recommend watching it, but I watched it on double speed, so then it's only an hour.
Yeah. I watched it on, I can't understand things quite that quickly, but I watched it on 1.5, and it was just fascinating watching. And it's
But it came
not
across
actually
very different to the memes and everything about it. It seemed to be like they were just going to talk about how much they were going to bomb Iran, and then when you watch the whole thing, it's like, why is Israel infiltrating us, or is Israel spying on us? And he was a bit like, all countries spy on people, but it's a bit like, yeah, but it's fine when Israel do it. Like, it's very different than how it has been portrayed in the media.
It was a much more substantive conversation than we're used to getting, I think is
Oh yeah,
the key
absolutely.
point. I think that a lot of these Congress people get to go on these shows and do these like 5-minute hits where they just sort of, there are multiple times in this conversation where Ted Cruz sort of does his soundbite, and then Tucker Carlson goes, hey, let's like interrogate that a little bit. And then Ted Cruz just has to move on. So Ted Cruz has this whole smarmy thing set up where he's like, well, we really only give Israel $3 billion a year.
The support for Israel, very expensive. How much support do we give to Israel?
Well, you tell me, you vote for it.
Yeah, it's about $3 billion a year is the military assistance.
Which is perfect for a 2-minute hit on Fox News or on CNN or MSNBC, places that are nominally a little more antagonistic. And then Tucker's like, well, yeah, but how much have we given them to fight Iran over the past couple of weeks?
So what is it costing to support the bombing campaign to protect Israel right now from Iran?
So I don't know right now.
And he doesn't even get to like, how much have we given them over the past 2 years, which is...
Because I think he gives them the like boilerplate. It's like there's some number that's only 2-3 billion, but it's not including a whole bunch of other stuff.
Well, it's not including everything after October 7th.
Mm-hmm.
So the Biden and Trump administrations have poured tens of billions of dollars. I think, we're easily topping $30 billion over the past 2 years for a tiny, tiny country of 10 million people. And that's just including the weapons we've sent directly to Israel. That's not including how much it's cost to have 3 or 4 aircraft carriers basically operating so that they can support Israel, at least since the fall of 2024.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's and it's a ton of money. But so Ted Cruz does this also with the Bible quote. Well, the Bible says, and then Tucker Carlson's like, no, okay, let's talk about that Bible quote. And he's just sort of like, deer in headlights. There's nothing substantive here. There are just pull quotes for idiots. It's fascinating. And Tucker Carlson did us a real service illustrating just how there's no there. These are not like finely tuned experts, as we can tell by like the fact that the Iran attack, it basically guaranteed the one thing they said they didn't want to happen, which was, an Iranian nuclear bomb. Like, they're not deep thinkers here. Making these decisions. They are people who just are not used to being challenged for the really bad ideas that they are bribed into effectuating by defense contractors.
But we can at least all agree that Washington, D.C. needs cleaned up.
You're right. I love Washington, D.C. That's a great place. And if it got any cleaner, it would disappear.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a safe, overly Disneyfied city, as far as I'm concerned. But that's because I'm a crotchety old man.
So yes, Tucker Carlson is our sort of what is it? Chaotic evil, chaotic neutral.
Definitely a chaotic evil, but sometimes it works to all of our benefits,
Mm-hmm.
and it was delightful to see the greater evil of Ted Cruz get demolished by the lesser evil of Tucker Carlson.
And sadly, America is dissolving and rotting away, according to Tucker.
I mean, there's you can make some cases. I'm more optimistic than that. I think the tools are all in front of us. Unfortunately for Tucker Carlson, none of the appropriate tools are things that he has spent his life advocating. But the crazy thing is, and it's worth Googling Tucker Carlson on libertarianism, is I think Tucker knows that too. Ted Cruz certainly doesn't. Ted Cruz still wants to talk about Ronald Reagan and free enterprise or whatever. But I think Tucker Carlson might have a clearer picture that a lot of the New Deal stuff he spent his young adulthood railing against and helping to dismantle might be a lot more useful than you'd think. So,
okay. Well, on that potentially optimistic note, we'll catch you next time.
All right. Thanks a lot.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.